pause. All
Got
right. Well, it's great to see you. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. Thanks for taking the time.
it.
So let's get right into it. We're going to start easy. I'd love to hear a bit about the beginning of your composition journey, and were there any artists or pieces that gave you that initial spark?
Yeah, I didn't know how to read music or do much of anything as a kid, but I remember going around and saying, I'm thinking of a piece that I've never heard. And I must have been writing that piece in my head. I was taking licks that I'd heard out of jazz pieces and pop music of the time and inventing it. And I just didn't know what to do with that. So I realized that I kind of started immediately. As soon as I was hearing music, I was recomposing it. And doing it pretty much the way everybody does. You hear music that you like and you say, well, I'd like to do something like that. If you happen to be the kind of mind that likes to recombine things. And that's what a composer is. Nobody ever invented anything. No composer ever invented anything. The most original composer you can think of was still working with materials that were around. So that's all any of us ever does. And then as you work, you say, well, it would be interesting to combine this other thing with this other thing.
Yeah.
You eventually you start to come up with things, then they build on themselves, and you find that you've written a bunch of pieces.
Wow. So you were almost a composer before you even knew what a composer
Absolutely.
was. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then once I started taking piano lessons, which wasn't until I was like 12, much too late to become a virtuoso, alas. All the virtuosos started when they were 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Seven at the latest. But it just wasn't in the family. We listened to music, but it wasn't a thing to have people do music. But once I started, I couldn't stop. And I realized that I could hear the notes even if I wasn't playing them. So I would hear Beatle tunes on the radio or something like that and say, oh, I know how to do that. And I would go back and play it. And so my ear was developing, and that was also part of it. So it was jazz and rock and all the things that were going on in like the 60s. Anything that was around was part of what I was doing. Classical music, I knew a little bit of Prokofiev and Stravinsky and Berlioz and Beethoven. And I played a little bit of Bach and Mozart from piano lessons. But I was in a rock band in high school, of course. And we were called the Sleepless Nights with a K.
Oh, yeah. That's fun.
That's a real high school band name.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's sort of where I started, and I got to college and I said, I actually probably belong in that classical world. And I probably should be writing for oboes and things that aren't on the records that I've been listening to, and find out about Bartok and Schoenberg and Stravinsky for real. And once I started playing those things at the piano and getting excited about it and composing with people who had been to Yale and were involved in that modern classical world, and then learning to conduct and all of that stuff, I kind of eased myself out of pre-med and into writing modern classical music, so-called.
Wow. So it sounds like you've had a similar journey to many other classical musicians, where the love of music starts from what's on the radio and it continues to expand into the classical world. I'd love to hear more about what are some of your greatest musical influences, at least within the classical world.
Yeah, well, once I was there, then I was playing Bartok, and I was listening constantly to Stravinsky, and I got into Schoenberg a little bit, but I was never that hot into Schoenberg. But I was into Stefan Volpe, a wonderful composer who's mostly forgotten today. Varese, I listened to constantly. By the time I was a senior in college, I had 2 LPs that I played the grooves off of, maybe 3. I would say they were the Varese collected big works, and I can't remember. Robert Kraft had the recording or somebody like that on Columbia. Bonnie Raitt, first 2 records of Bonnie Raitt, and Miles Davis Bitches Brew. Maybe we could add Company by Stephen Sondheim.
Okay.
So all of those things were going on by the early 70s as I was graduating from college in 73. All of that stuff was a big part of my thinking. Pop music, I continued to play pop music. I played jazz, I played clubs, all through grad school. And so that was something, you weren't supposed to write it for the teachers. They didn't approve of tonal music, really. If you weren't expanding
Mhm.
the boundaries of what could be considered a melody or harmony or a rhythm or something like that. And I tried to expand, and those pieces are okay, but they're a little hard to listen to. But I hear them and I say, no, I was trying to do the same thing I'm trying to do now. And anyway, so that's a little bit of a picture of the influences, so to speak.
Wow. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I'd love to also, we just talked about your musical influences, but what are some influences that might not be music related that people might be surprised to hear inspire you?
Well, I'm a reader,
Mhm.
so I've been reading poetry and fiction pretty heavily for a long time, and right now I work with poets all the time. And although today I'm writing my own lyrics for a new song cycle,
Wow.
which I've never done. It's based on research, but I can't talk about what it is. But I will tell you that I have done biographical research on the 20th century figure uh, whose life and words I am adapting into a song cycle. But I'm writing the lyric.
Exciting. Well, stay tuned for those of you watching this
Yeah,
interview. Keep an eye out.
but yeah, but the poetry has been a big thing. I co-teach a class at Emerson College called Poetry and Song, where I
Mhm.
co-teach it with a poet. And Anna VQ Ross has been my co-teacher for a while. I've
Okay.
set her words, and she was part of a group of 5 Boston poets, all of whom at a program this past year at the Boston Athenaeum, each one read a poem of theirs, and then I accompanied a singer in a setting of that poem. And so we had a full poetry and song evening. But poetry and song has been kind of an important part of my life for a long time. I studied songwriting with Virgil Thompson privately.
Mhm.
Uh, and he of course had worked with a lot of great poets, Gertrude Stein, Frank O'Hara. He introduced me to Kenneth Koch, uh,
Mm.
and I did a whole opera with Kenneth.
Yeah.
Uh, and I did another smaller music theater piece with Kenneth Koch. Got to be friends with him. I still know his widow. So the poetry world I'm pretty connected to, but it's a very close connection to music. It's not like oh gosh, Scott's into entomology or something. I'm not. I don't know anything about that sort of stuff. I'm a tennis player. That's off of music. That's completely different. My music mind turns off when I play tennis.
It's always good to have an opportunity to, I don't know, segment the mind a little bit.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about what was one of the main challenges that you had in your composition career, and how did you work through that?
Well, everybody has a million challenges all the time. The first one is technique.
Mhm.
Is how do you write what you want to write?
Yeah.
And I had some very good teachers, but somehow come to it a little bit late. The conservatory guys were way ahead of me, and they were almost all guys in those days. But they knew so much more music than I did. Many of them had better piano skills and stuff. So I had to really make a point of studying, learning the repertoire, playing through things, sight reading every day. Every day I would do a Haydn sonata or a Mozart string quartet and just barrel through the best I could to learn score reading. I did then the Haydn symphonies and Mozart symphonies, and even hacked my way horribly through the Beethovens. So that was the first thing, technically, to understand what I was doing, and then to learn how to orchestrate. It helped that I started conducting a new music ensemble of my own. So I was working with real players on real concerts all the time. And it gave me a little bit of a kind of a street sense of what's going to work and what's not. So that I would see my friends who were writing off of the page and off sometimes row considerations and other mathematical kinds of considerations. And I said, man, this is going to take forever in rehearsal. And I knew because I was in rehearsals doing it. And so my writing was a little more practical, but I had to slowly build up to being able to write a symphony. And it took me until I was 35 before I was able to write a symphony. After which I wrote something that was a dramatic cantata and became immediately a one-act opera. But I had been music directing musicals and operas for a long time by then. So again, I had a kind of a street sense of what it's like to be in the pit. And opera, it's terribly important for people to have an idea what it's like to work with a singer, what it's like to work with somebody who's on stage, with lights and costumes, and getting practice dealing with stage directors and choreographers and designers, where I was in meetings with them all the time, co-teaching with acting teachers for musical theater class, studio class. All of those things turned out to be really, really important. And I was slowly developing technique.
And they
what I felt like saying.
Yeah, they probably don't teach how to chat with stage directors and designers in school. That's probably something you just have to, you figure out as you go.
Not only that, what Virgil said is they don't even teach how to do word setting.
Yeah.
He would say, well, I've got the recipes and they don't teach them in the schools. So I went to him and I got his recipes, which eventually he put into a book, which exists, and it has all of that stuff. But I prefer my actual original notes from his class to the book.
That's amazing. And I think also, hearing that, I think something that resonates with a lot of musicians, especially right now, there's this obsession with prodigies and people just bursting out of school with massive success, and especially in our social media world where people want quick validation. So, writing your first symphony at 35, it's an example to everyone that it's never too late. You're going to continue to build your craft. You're going to continue to grow. I don't know. I
felt very young at 35, and I feel like I was, and I did it the way I had to.
Yeah.
And I think everybody goes at their own pace. I love lots of the young prodigies. I don't have anything against them.
Oh, no, that wasn't nothing against that. I know it's just there seems to be such a obsession with youth, and so it's just nice to remind all of us that it just takes time to develop. That's all. Yeah.
So,
I would, you were talking a bit about some of the music that you felt pressured to write in school, and with this bit of conflict with what you really wanted to write, what your inner voice wanted to write. I'd love to hear about a piece that you're particularly proud of.
Well, it was, I'd say that the construction of Boston, my first opera, one act opera, it's out on Naxos, would represent that after the symphony, a year later, I came up with this piece, and it was on Kenneth Koch, and it was comic and it was operatic. The construction of Boston is not about the actual construction of Boston. It's a theater piece where the people who construct Boston were the artists who did it as a stage piece at the time. Were Robert Rauschenberg, Jean Tinguely, and Nicky de Saint-Phal. And so they are all characters in my opera singing the words that Kenneth wrote for them. And so that Rauschenberg brought the weather and the people.
Mhm.
And apparently he brought on in the original a rain machine onto the stage for representing the weather. And Tangley was building the buildings and the subway, and Nicky de Saint-Phal was shooting her paint gun and making art and beauty out of it all.
Yeah.
It's funny and it's very touching, actually. And I had to find a way to combine the most serious, hardworking classical techniques I had ever learned with tonal ideas and traditional kinds of beauty, including traditional kinds of vocal beauty. And once I did that, I started to feel like, okay, I had more or less put it together. So this, I was about 36, 37 when that was happening. And since then, I've been looking for all sorts of ways to keep putting together those elements. I was glad I had all that difficult, highbrow training. But finally, I wanted to hear what I wanted to hear and play it with audiences and players who enjoyed doing it. And I've been doing that for many years since then, and it seems to be going okay.
I could imagine how exciting it must be to feel all these pieces coming together and have that kind of self-validation in your work.
I'd say that this current thing where I'm really writing the lyrics myself is another level of putting those things together. I've done a little bit of writing my own lyrics. The first one was not a complete success. It was written actually for Renee Fleming, of all people, and she never did it. And I think she could have done it, but she didn't feel like it. But Susanna Phillips did it and did it beautifully. And I have a recording of that, but I could do it better now with this experience of writing my own lyrics. And anyway, so other people have done that song. That it's really a big shame that I wrote with my own text. Anyway, so I keep on playing with that. That's another thing where I'm putting the pieces together.
Yeah, that's interesting.
There are lots of people who did that. Obviously, Wagner, the great composer writing now, doing her own librettos is Judith Weir. And my friend Kate Soper does that. Who else? Well, Matt O'Coin did so for his first couple of operas. He's working with other people now, but he's a real literary character as well as musical, of course, and a real writer of prose too, as you know. It's a little rare. I think that Menotti did a beautiful job, by and large, of writing his own libretti, and Tippett less so. I'm not crazy about the Tippett librettos. I think Tippett was wise would have been wise to work with more with more literary people as Henze did
Mm.
in that general genre. I think Henze came up with some terrific operas. Be great if we heard them more.
Well, we'll see what the future of martial opera is. I, I'd love, speaking of listening to more, hearing more operas that aren't done too often. It does feel like we're in a very transitional period as far as opera production goes. And, we've got lots of companies closing. We have a lot of companies, tiny little chamber companies popping up. And a lot of companies are also changing their perspective on how they're doing programming. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how new music and modern music plays a role in that and the future of opera.
Yeah. Every generation or two, composers feel like, we have to totally redo opera. We have to, and they almost always say the same thing, we have to go back to the basics. And this is like probably Monteverdi said this, and Gluck said this, and Wagner and Virgil said this, and Britten, and everybody says we have to return to the basics of telling a story through singing. And we've got so distracted by so many other external things that are getting in the way. And if we can just somehow return to that, then audiences will be excited to be connecting more directly to the work instead of putting all these obstacles in their way, which we keep on doing. So I'm there. That's what I want to see happen. What does that mean? I don't know. Everybody means different things by it.
So is that the direction that you feel that new music is heading in, or?
I don't know where new music is heading. I scratch my head when I see what's happening in new music. I say, really? Is that a good idea? Often, all too often, I say that, but hey, maybe it is. Maybe somehow it will turn out to be. I'll tell you what I think is, I have seen more really truly professional work in the last 20 years, say in this century roughly, coming out of musical theater, out of commercial musical theater and non-commercial musical theater, than I have out of opera, out of new opera.
Yeah.
There are some very impressive works of new opera, but they are almost never as professionally done as the best musical theater. And it's not just Sondheim. Obviously, Sondheim has practically nothing in the 21st century, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But the number of people writing operas now who don't even know what Sondheim did, don't really understand it. Even if they claim that somehow it has something to do with Sondheim, it almost never does. When they use it as an excuse to not write songs or not write tunes, they think that's what he did, which is not true. If they even know. And many of the people who are most known in opera don't seem to have any clue of what Sondheim was doing. And he solved so much. He gave us so many wonderful avenues to explore that. So I would say that it exists, but it's mostly in musical theater where people can still go to Broadway and see amazing stuff. Some of it's comedies, and you think, oh, it's just very silly, but it's not. It's, you look closely and you see how beautifully written it is, and how perfectly timed, and how what's happening on stage and what's happening in the singer's diction and what's happening in the orchestration all works together to make the same piece. And there are way too many operas where there are lots of different pieces going on and they're not actually the same piece, or it doesn't seem there. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a visual piece, and there's a musical piece, and there's a text piece, and there's probably a political agenda, and none of them is really working together.
Mm.
And I say,
Yeah.
no, wait, look at musicals. We know how to do that. And audiences actually come to those. They're really good.
Absolutely.
We could do that. We could do that in our own way. Wouldn't that be great?
I mean, one of the pieces that comes to mind that like of recent Broadway is The Band's Visit. I think about that music and the
Great.
attention to detail, and it just felt so natural. And it's something that I do miss in opera and in new music.
That's a great word, natural.
Yeah.
That's what I'm anyway. I'm trying.
Well, I want to wrap things up on a reflective note. I'd love to hear what you would say to your younger self during the process, during the doubts.
Sure. Being a nice guy and a good colleague is not the same thing as letting people walk all over you.
Mm.
Yeah, so that my experiences with the big shots have been a little troubling, and I would handle them a little different now and say, no, actually, I know what I'm doing, and it's okay to walk away from a situation that is not doing any good for my work.
Mm.
I've had a couple of situations where I stuck it out thinking that was what was important, was to be a good colleague. And I say, nah, actually, that was probably, it probably would have been better to stick up for myself and get it right.
Yeah.
But it's hard to know how to balance those, because there are people who are, it's a personal thing. I would tend to be the gentleman in the situation, trying to be the good colleague, but that can be a fault.
Yeah.
That doesn't apply to everybody. There are people who need to learn the opposite.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
There are lots of us, but there are lots of us who are like me,
Mhm.
and who make that error of being a little too cautious to ask for what's absolutely necessary. And I would come out and I would think about it, and I'd say, this person who was making cuts in the workshop actually didn't understand or even like my work. What the hell was I allowing that to happen?
Mm. Yeah.
And I'll say, no, I'm going to fix it now.
Yeah.
Next time around, I'm fixing it. Anyway.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's definitely a challenging balance, and there's so many personalities in this field. And
luckily you as a singer never run into that kind of problem, right?
Oh, never. Yeah.
Every singer I know has had to face that kind of situation with auditions and casting and productions and everything.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that is universal. I think that extends outside of the music industry, and it's always a balance, how to play nicely in the sand pit.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you again for chatting with me. This has really been fantastic. And you left me with a lot to think about, and I hope that anyone watching this on YouTube gets to leave with some insight. So thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you soon.
See ya.
Bye-bye.